Twilight sits against the nursery window like ash-gray cloth, softening the corners of a room that was supposed to be bright. On the floor, a grieving father sits beside an unassembled crib, the pieces still stacked with instructions he no longer has the strength to open. The smell of fresh paint is still there. But the room has no sound. That is what breaks him first. Not the objects. Not the empty walls. The silence. Because silence is never empty when your mind is crowded with what should have been. The first cry, the small breathing in the dark, the late nights, the tired hands, the ordinary future that suddenly has nowhere to go. So what does discipline mean in a room where nothing can be fixed? This is not about escaping grief. It is about learning how to stand inside the silence without letting it erase you. The father does not move for a long time. His back is against the nursery wall. His knees are drawn up. One hand rests on the floorboards, palm flat, as if the house itself might answer him if he stays still enough. Across from him, the unassembled crib leans in separate pieces against the wall. Rails, screws, pale wood, plastic bags of hardware, a small paper manual folded too neatly to belong in a room like this. Outside, the suburban street keeps behaving like nothing has happened. A car rolls past with its headlights on early. Somewhere down the block, a garage door opens. A dog barks once, then stops. The world has the nerve to continue. Inside the nursery, the gray sky presses against the window. Fresh paint still hangs in the air, clean and hopeful, and that smell becomes almost cruel. Paint is for beginnings. Paint is for preparing. Paint is for believing that a room will soon be filled with motion. But there is no motion here. There is no rocking chair creak. No small blanket shifting. No tired whisper from the doorway. No sound that belongs to the future he had already built in his mind. This is the confrontation. Not a battle with another person. Not an argument. Not a crisis where he can solve something by standing up fast and taking charge. This is worse in a quieter way. This is a man facing the room that still remembers the life he was preparing for. And the mind, when it meets this kind of silence, does not stay silent. It starts filling the room with noise. It plays the version of the future that was supposed to happen. It runs scenes he never got to live. It places invisible weight in the empty crib. It hears footsteps that are not there. It turns every object into an accusation. The crib should have been built. The room should have been finished. He should have known what to do. He should have been able to protect the future from breaking. That word, should, becomes the storm after the storm. It is not loud in the ears. It is loud behind the eyes. It is the noise of a life that no longer has a place to land. And this is where many people misunderstand discipline. They think discipline means standing up, wiping the face, tightening the jaw, and pretending the silence does not hurt. They think command means control over every feeling. They think strength means leaving the room before the room can touch them. But that is not command. That is escape dressed in hard clothing. A man can be busy and still be running. He can clean the garage, answer emails, repaint the wall, throw away the instructions, avoid the doorway, turn on every television in the house, and call it strength. But if every action is only an attempt to avoid hearing the silence, then the silence is still in command. Zanshin asks for something harder and quieter. It asks him to remain aware after the impact. Not heroic. Not dramatic. Aware. Zanshin is the discipline of staying present when the mind wants to scatter. It is the attention that does not abandon the room just because the room is painful. It is the ability to notice the smallest detail before the imagination turns the entire night into a punishment. The unassembled crib becomes the first test. At first, it looks like proof of failure. A father sees the pieces on the floor and thinks they are unfinished because he is unfinished. He looks at the screws in the plastic bag and feels the insult of order. Everything has a place. Everything has a sequence. Insert tab A into slot B, tighten the bolt. Stand the frame upright. But grief has no manual folded in clean paper. So the mind rebels. It wants to turn the crib into a verdict. It wants to say, this should not be here. It wants to say, I cannot look at this. It wants to make the object carry the whole weight of the loss. That is the undisciplined movement of the mind, not because the pain is wrong, but because the mind is trying to survive by turning pain into noise. It throws him backward into memory. It throws him forward into dread. It makes the present room disappear beneath all the rooms that will never exist. The disciplined movement is smaller. He does not have to love the crib. He does not have to assemble it. He does not have to decide what it means tonight. He only has to see it clearly. Pale wood against the wall. One long rail leaning slightly crooked. A clear bag of screws near his right foot. The folded instruction sheet untouched. A stripe of gray light across the floor. The smell of paint. The absence of sound. That is not coldness. That is mercy through attention. Because the present moment, even this one, is smaller than the nightmare the mind creates around it. The room is painful, but it is still a room. The crib is heartbreaking, but it is still wood, hardware, paper, shape. The silence is heavy, but it is not an enemy unless he gives it a voice and lets it speak for everything. The father's body tells the truth before his thoughts do. His breath is shallow. His shoulders are lifted. His hand keeps touching the floor, then pulling away, then touching it again. His eyes avoid the crib for a few seconds, then return to it like he is checking whether the world has changed. It has not. This is why stillness can feel dangerous. In stillness, there is nowhere to hide from what the mind has been carrying. Noise can make a person feel protected. Tasks can make a person feel useful. Anger can make a person feel powerful. But silence removes the disguise. In the empty nursery, there is no role to perform. Only a father. Only twilight. Only the unfinished crib and the impossible weight of what should have been. And yet, this is also where samurai discipline becomes real in the modern world. Not in a battlefield. Not in a movie. Not in a speech about toughness. Here. In a suburban home, on a painted floor, under a gray sky, with a man who cannot fix the central fact of his pain. Discipline does not ask him to defeat grief. It asks him not to let grief turn his attention into a weapon against himself. That difference matters. The shadow in this room is not silence itself. The shadow is the noise hidden inside silence, the endless rehearsal of a future that was promised by hope but not guaranteed by life. The father is not weak because he hears that noise. He is human. The danger begins when he believes every sound the mind invents. Zanshin gives him one clean instruction: observe before you obey. Observe the thought, this room should be full. Observe the breath tightening. Observe the hand curling. Observe the urge to leave, to destroy the quiet, to find any sound that proves he is not alone with it. Then return to one detail. The crib rail. The gray light. The smell of paint. The floor under his palm. No sound. Again. No sound. The room does not become easy. It does not become peaceful in the cheap way people use that word. But it becomes exact. And exactness gives him a place to stand. Because when a man can look at one painful object without letting the mind turn it into the whole universe, he has recovered the first inch of command. Not the whole life. 1 inch. In that inch, there is dignity. Discipline does not begin after you feel calm. It begins in the first second you realize you are about to lose command. For the father on the nursery floor, that second is small. It does not look like a breakthrough. It looks like his hand tightening against the floorboards while his mind starts building another future that will never arrive. It looks like his eyes landing on the unassembled crib and wanting to turn away. It looks like the room becoming too quiet, then too loud inside him. So the first practice is not to stand up. It is not to fix the room. It is to stop feeding the storm. He lets one breath enter without forcing it to become noble. He lets one breath leave without asking it to carry the whole loss out of him. Then, in the privacy of his own mind, he names what is happening with plain words. This is grief. This is the noise of what should have been. This is my mind trying to fill the silence. No speech. No performance. No dramatic promise that tomorrow will be different. Just the clean act of naming the weather inside him without becoming the weather. That is the first cut of Zanshin. Attention before reaction. Then he anchors the body in the present. His palm presses into the painted floor. Not hard. Just enough to feel the boards beneath him. His thumb finds a tiny ridge where a drop of dried paint has hardened near the baseboard. His feet notice the floor. His back notices the wall. His eyes return to the crib rail leaning against the nursery wall. Pale wood. Clear plastic bag. Folded instructions. Gray light. No sound. The mind wants the crib to mean everything at once. It wants to make the crib a symbol, a wound, a courtroom, a sentence. But the practice is to let the object become specific again. The rail is a rail. The screws are screws. The paper is paper. The silence is silence. He does not reduce the loss. He reduces the chaos around the loss. That distinction is the training. A person can drown in a moment not because the moment is small, but because the mind keeps adding rooms to it. The nursery becomes the hospital. The hospital becomes the phone calls. The phone calls become holidays, birthdays, school mornings, photographs, the sound of a small voice that never came. Suddenly the father is not sitting in one room at twilight. He is being pulled through a lifetime of absence. So he shrinks the battle. Not forever. Just now. He looks at the crib and gives himself one honest boundary: not tonight. He does not have to assemble it. He does not have to remove it. He does not have to decide whether the room stays a nursery or becomes something else. Those decisions belong to another hour, when his body has more ground under it. Tonight, the battle is smaller. Sit. Breathe. Notice. Do not run from the room. Do not turn the silence into proof that you have been abandoned by life. Then comes the next action. He picks up one screw from the plastic bag. Not to build the crib. To return his attention to scale. The screw is light in his palm. Ridiculously small for the weight it carries in his mind. Its metal edge presses into his skin. He rolls it once between finger and thumb. The room stays silent. The sky outside stays gray. The fresh paint still smells like a future that got interrupted. And still, the screw is only a screw. This is not denial. This is precision. Zanshin trains the mind to stop making every object carry more meaning than it can hold. Grief will bring meaning. Memory will bring meaning. Love will bring meaning. But panic brings distortion. It turns one piece of hardware into the whole universe and then asks a tired father to hold it alone. He places the screw back in the bag. That is another practice: put one thing where it belongs. Not because order can solve loss. It cannot. But because one correct movement tells the nervous body, I am still here. I can still choose one honest action. He straightens the instruction sheet without opening it. He slides the plastic bag 2 inches away from his knee so he will not crush it by accident. He rests the crib rail more securely against the wall so it will not fall in the night. Each movement is small enough to be done without pretending. Each movement refuses the lie that grief must either collapse him or make him instantly strong. There is a third path. Presence. A man in command does not become untouched. He becomes reachable by the present moment, even when the present moment hurts. The father lets his eyes move slowly around the nursery. The corner where the rocking chair was supposed to go. The outlet cover he meant to replace. The faint line where blue tape had protected the trim. The clean wall with nothing hanging on it yet. He does not force gratitude. He does not hunt for a lesson. He does not rush toward meaning because meaning can become another form of noise when it is demanded too early. He simply observes. And when the mind says, this should have been different, he does not argue with it. Some thoughts do not need a debate. They need a boundary. He answers inwardly, yes, it should have been. Then he returns to the floor under his palm. This is how ritual begins in pain. Not as ceremony. Not as decoration. As a path back. One breath. One object. One true sentence. One small movement. One boundary against the storm. The ritual may last 2 minutes. It may last 10. It does not matter. What matters is that he repeats it without making it a performance. When the noise of what should have been rises again, he does not shame himself for hearing it. He notices it. He names it. He returns. Breath. Floor. Crib. Gray light. No sound. Again. Over time, the unassembled crib becomes more than an unfinished task. It becomes the place where attention learns not to abandon him. At first, he can only look at it for a few seconds. Later, maybe longer. One day, perhaps, he will decide what to do with it. Assemble it. Store it. Give it away. Leave it untouched for a season. But the decision must come from presence, not from the panic of escaping silence. That is the discipline. Not control over life. Command over the next movement. In the empty nursery, Shugyo is not sweat on a gym floor or miles under harsh weather. It is the harder training of staying with reality when reality offers no reward for staying. It is the father learning that silence does not have to be filled immediately. It can be witnessed. It can be survived one breath at a time. It can become a room where the mind stops swinging at shadows and begins, slowly, to stand. The storm has passed outside. Inside, the air is still heavy. But his hand is open now. And that is not nothing. The room does not change first. That is important. The gray sky remains pressed against the window. The fresh paint still hangs in the air. The unassembled crib still leans against the wall in separate pieces, silent and unfinished. Nothing about the nursery offers him a clean ending. There is no sudden warmth, no sign, no sentence that makes the loss smaller. But the father changes his position inside the room. His shoulders lower. His hand opens on the floor. His breath, still uneven, begins to arrive from a deeper place. Not peaceful. Not steady in the way people imagine when they talk from outside the storm. Just less trapped. Less hunted by the noise behind his eyes. Earlier, the silence had felt like an accusation. Now, for one breath, it is only silence. That is the first visible transformation. Not happiness. Not closure. Accuracy. He looks at the unassembled crib again, and the mind still tries to rush ahead. It still wants to throw him into the future that never came. It still wants to fill the room with the sound of what should have been. But now he can notice the movement before it carries him away. The storm rises. He sees it rising. And because he sees it, he is no longer completely inside it. This is the power of Zanshin in grief, awareness after impact. The disciplined mind does not demand that pain disappear before it returns to the present. It returns while the pain is still there. It places one hand on the floor. It lets the eye rest on one object. It refuses to let imagination become the only witness in the room. The father reaches toward the crib rail. He does not lift it all the way. He only touches the edge of the pale wood with 2 fingers. The surface is smooth, almost too smooth, the kind of smoothness chosen by someone who once imagined safety, sleep, and tiny hands gripping the rail in the dark. The touch hurts. He lets it hurt. Then he lets the wood be wood. That is command. A few minutes ago, the crib was a monument to everything missing. Now it is still heartbreaking, but it is also specific. A rail. A bag of screws. A folded instruction sheet. A thing prepared with love before life changed shape. The object has not been rescued from sorrow. It has been rescued from distortion. And in that small rescue, the father recovers a part of himself. He adjusts the rail so it rests more securely against the wall. The movement is careful. Almost ordinary. He does not do it to prove strength. He does it because the rail might fall, and he is still someone who can keep one thing from falling. That is enough for this moment. He slides the plastic bag of hardware beside the instruction sheet. He places the loose screw he had held back with the others. He wipes a small streak of dust from the floor with his thumb. These actions do not fix the loss. They do not pretend to. But they tell the room something true. I am still here. I can still meet what is in front of me. The nursery becomes different because his attention becomes different. Before, every corner had been shouting. The empty wall. The unused outlet cover. The smell of paint. The place where the rocking chair was supposed to go. Each detail had been dragged into the noise of should have been. Now the details return one by one. The wall is a wall. The corner is a corner. The paint is paint. The crib is unfinished. The silence is real. And somehow, reality is gentler than the storm the mind makes when it tries to hold an entire lost future at once. This is not a lesson in moving on. That phrase is too small for a room like this. Some losses do not move on command. Some rooms remain difficult. Some evenings will still catch him off guard when the sky turns gray and the house becomes quiet in that particular way. Samurai discipline does not ask him to become untouched by those evenings. It asks him to become trustworthy inside them. Modern discipline is not a hard face in public and collapse in private. It is the quiet skill of returning to the present without insulting what the heart has lost. It is the courage to let grief be grief without giving it the keys to every movement, every room, every breath. The father sits there until the light thins. At some point, the nursery grows darker. The window no longer shows a gray sky, only a dull reflection of the room behind him. He can see his own shape on the glass now, a man on the floor, tired, bent, still breathing. Earlier, that reflection might have looked like defeat. Now it looks like witness. He has not conquered the silence. He has sat with it long enough to learn its edges. He has found the difference between the silence of the room and the noise of what should have been. One belongs to the present. The other belongs to the mind reaching for a future it cannot retrieve. He cannot stop that reaching forever. But tonight, he can guide it back. His eyes return to the unassembled crib one more time. It is still unfinished. Yet it no longer feels only like failure. It also carries evidence of love. Someone chose it. Someone brought it home. Someone believed enough to open a room and paint the walls before knowing how the story would turn. Love was here before loss entered. That matters. The father does not need to know what the crib will become. He does not need to make a clean decision before the night ends. He only needs to leave the room with one act of respect. So he gathers the instruction sheet and places it flat on top of the crib box. He tucks the hardware bag beside it. He makes sure the rail is stable. Then he stands slowly, one hand against the wall, not because he is suddenly strong, but because his body has remembered how to rise without fleeing. At the doorway, he turns back. The room is still empty. The storm is quieter. And the silence no longer owns the whole house. This is transformation in its most honest form. The outside remains unfinished, but the inner posture changes. The man who entered the nursery as a captive of what should have been leaves as someone who can carry one breath, one object, one step, without surrendering his command. The crib remains unassembled. So does the future. But he is present now. And presence is the first frame strong enough to hold sorrow. Every person has a room they do not want to enter. For some, it is a hospital hallway. For others, a kitchen after an argument, an office after failure, a garage full of tools that belong to someone else, a bedroom too quiet after the life they imagined changed shape. For this father, it is the nursery at twilight. The unassembled crib remains there, not as a problem to solve tonight, but as a witness. The fresh paint still smells like a beginning. The house still holds no sound. Yet he has learned the first command: do not let the noise of what should have been steal the moment that still is. If this spoke to you, stay with samurai discipline. Return when your own silence gets heavy. Mastery begins when the smallest detail becomes worthy of your full attention.